The St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology really has at the core of its mission to help laity, clergy, seminarians, and religious know and love Scripture from the heart of the church. Biblical literacy for the faithful, biblical fluency for priests and religious. Now, I think more than ever, we need the laity to pray and fast as never before. We also need religious and women responding to the call of holiness in religious life like never before. We are so excited about this book, Called by God, which gives a practical and moving guide for women open to religious life. I'm very proud to introduce our author, Rachael Collins. Rachael attended the University of New South Wales, where she received undergraduate degrees in science and law. She studied at Princeton University and Oxford University and has a master's degree from Columbia Law School and the Australian Catholic University. She was an associate judicial clerk at the High Court of Australia and was admitted in the bar in New York, where she worked for Clifford Chance. She resides in New York with her husband and children. Please help me in welcoming Rachael Collins.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be here tonight. I'd like to begin by starting with a rather obvious question. How did a married woman end up writing a book for young women on discerning and preparing for religious life? What would an attorney have to say about entering the convent? It's almost as baffling as, say, a Hollywood star abandoning her successful film career to become a nun. Well, you don't have to be a religious sister or a nun to understand and appreciate the beauty of religious life. From a young age, the beauty of religious life was the beauty of a life devoted to Jesus, to love himself, was very obvious to me. And I was inspired by nuns and religious sisters. In fact, the first leader I knew and admired outside of my immediate family was Sister Bernadette. And she was the headmaster of our very small Catholic elementary school. Later on, I learned about amazing powerhouse Catholic women like St. Teresa of Avila, St. Catherine of Siena, and from my own country, St. Mary MacKillop. I wanted to emulate them. So at 13, as a freshman in high school, I got out the yellow pages. It was the early 1990s. And I looked up the convent nearest to our house. And after school, one day I went, completely unbeknownst to my parents, and in my school uniform, I knocked on the door and presented myself as a candidate for entry into their order. Now, they hadn't had a vocation in about 2 decades, and they had no idea what to do with a 13-year-old girl. So various phone calls were made, I was sent home, and eventually my father sought me out and he said, "Rach, I got a call from Father Jim. Is there something you want to tell me?" And I said, "Dad, I want to be nun." And in his broad Australian accent, my dad said, No. Why would you want to do that for?" But then he paused, and I could see the wheels turning, and I could see him thinking about what was going to come if I didn't become a nun. Dating, boys, heartbreak, leaving home, probably getting married. So finally he looked at me and he said, "You know what, Rach? You can just stay at home with me and Mum. You never have to leave home." Although I didn't appreciate his suggestion at the time, now that I'm a mother, I think my dad was onto something. When we consider that 50% of marriages end and 20 to 40% of marriages are hurt by infidelity, and fully 1/3 of women have been or will be physically abused by their partners, then a son-in-law like Jesus sounds perfect. What followed that conversation with my dad was a decade of very sporadic discernment. It took me a really, really long time to work out that I wasn't meant to be a nun. In fact, it wasn't until I was 23 and I sat down and I started to type out a letter formally requesting entry into Tyburn Convent, that I realised God didn't want me to be a nun. It struck me really forcefully, and it's difficult to find words to adequately describe the experience, but it struck me very forcefully that his will for me was otherwise. So when our babysitter and dear family friend, Marie-Therese, revealed to me that she was interested in becoming a religious sister, I had a lot to say about what not to do, because I had done pretty much everything you meant not to do when you're discerning. I looked for a book to buy for her, and I couldn't find anything. And, Amazon has books on everything, and I couldn't find a single book on this topic for her. So I wrote some thoughts down, and I spoke to some monks and nuns and religious sisters, and I researched what the church had to say about vocations. I read some encyclicals and St. Thomas Aquinas, but most importantly, I discovered an amazing treasure trove of writings by female blesseds and saints. Women like St. Edith Stein, St. Teresa of the Andes, St. Elizabeth of God, and Blessed Miriam Teresa Damjanovic, who, by the way, was from New Jersey. Did you know that New Jersey has its own blessed? Isn't that great? And what I learned is that good discernment goes hand in hand with two things. One, developing a solid spiritual life, and two, action, being proactive. Now, when I discerned, I spent an incredible amount of time sitting around thinking about my feelings, because I've been told that my vocation would satisfy the deepest desires of my heart, but I had absolutely no idea how to work out what they were. So I entered into a protracted, agonized, inward reflection, the kind of immobile self-absorption that really tested the patience of my spiritual director. Now, I had to wait. I was waiting and sitting around waiting for a light bulb moment where it would suddenly become very clear, and I had to wait an incredibly long time. Now, I don't discount that God does give light bulb moments to some people early on, but I don't think it's the norm. My own discernment lacked two things that fruitful discernment requires. And as I mentioned, one, a deepening of your spiritual life. What is your spiritual life? It's essentially your relationship with Jesus, your relationship with God. And it's founded on developing a solid prayer life, so a daily routine of mental prayer, and a solid sacramental life. So things like daily mass, weekly confession, Eucharistic adoration. And then two, the second thing you need to do is combine this with action. And by action, I mean such things as finding a spiritual director, reading the New Testament, going on an annual retreat, and reaching out to religious orders. Go make friends with sisters and nuns. Go visit some convents. Find out what it's like to be in a convent. Spend a week there. Familiarize yourself with the routine, the daily routine of a sister or a nun, and learn about the divine office. Another thing you can do is volunteer. So what gifts and talents has God given you? What do you love? What are you inspired by? What are you passionate about? If you love teaching, then maybe volunteer to teach CCD, or tutor a child whose parents might not otherwise be able to afford a tutor. If you love the unborn, you're concerned about protecting the unborn, then sign up for the 40 Days of Life. It's on right now. If you're concerned about and passionate about the marginalized and the poor, then perhaps volunteer at a soup kitchen run by the Missionaries of Charity, or talk to a Franciscan sister of the Renewal about doing social justice work overseas. And finally, and this might be, in fact, the most important, give yourself permission to date Jesus. Give it, say, between 6 to 18 months, and during that time say, I'm not going to date anyone else. I'm going to really focus on Jesus and see where he takes me. In this way, your vocation discernment actually becomes a form of preparation. As you grow closer to God, you'll begin to go deeper and deeper into the work of religious sister or nun, which at its very heart is essentially the work of prayer and love. What's a downside of this type of discernment? Little to none, not much opportunity cost. It's like a sanctity boot camp. And if you're not called, you'll be really well prepared for life in the world as a lay Catholic. In fact, this was how St. Thomas More discerned when he was discerning for the priesthood. He discerned by preparing. He prayed, he fasted, he read. One of his biographers noted that although he didn't enter, he was, in fact, better prepared for the priesthood than most men who do. And I firmly believe that this discernment period, this preparation period St. Thomas More entered into, is one of the reasons he was able to be a saint and martyr later on. Now, I'd like to make a bold claim, and it's this, that every young Catholic woman should ask herself, am I being called to religious life? And every young Catholic man should ask himself, am I being called to the priesthood or to religious life? And that they should think about this question before they really think about career or even marriage, and they should take it seriously. The way things are right now, many young people don't ask themselves this question. And in fact, a really large proportion of young people don't even realize that it's an option anymore. We need to encourage them. A recent survey found that the majority of newly professed sisters and recently ordained priests were encouraged by someone outside of their immediate family, typically in their teenage years, to consider a religious or priestly vocation. That person would have said something like, you know what, you'd be a great priest. I think you'd be a really, really great sister. And what the research found was that this encouragement did actually encourage them, prompt them to consider these vocations. Another thing that we can do, a helpful thing for us adults, is to be honest and authentic when we discuss our vocations. Young people often underestimate just how hard marriage life and family life can be. But they overestimate the sacrifices involved in religious life. Popular culture sells them an immature, inauthentic, and unrealistic conception of love. It's not mature. And so it's not always particularly apparent that in a good marriage, there's a death to self. A good marriage requires sacrifice. Family life requires sacrifice. It's hard sometimes. And that profound joy and emotional intimacy is also possible when your spouse happens to be divine. I have to tell you a story at this point. It's about the summer after our son was born, and he was our third child, and with his arrival we had 3 kids aged 3 and under. And he was a terrible sleeper. So we were chronically overtired and just a little bit stressed. That summer, we went to visit a college friend of my husband's who's now a Benedictine brother. And we had lunch with Brother Isidore. And you can imagine that lunch with our kids was chaotic and really noisy and very, how do I put it, messy. It's the exact opposite of the peace and order you get at mealtime and in Benedictine monastery. So as Brother Isidore was leaving, he stopped, and Brother Isidore was very gentle, so he meant this in the nicest way possible. And he said, "Thank you. Spending time with you makes me really grateful for my vocation." Now, admittedly, men and women are built for marriage. Marriage is a natural vocation, meaning that it's what we instinctively lean towards on account of our biological, emotional, and social makeup. Now, it's true, Jesus did elevate it into a sacrament, so it has a supernatural end. We can become saints through marriage. But it's also true that it remains true that marriage originated out of biological and social necessity, and so it retains these natural ends. And this is one reason that so many people enter into marriage without ever thinking about God or marriage as a path to sanctity. The same cannot be said of religious life. No one sort of just, at least these days, falls into it. Its ends are purely supernatural. When you choose to be religious, you are making an intentional choice for God. And it involves a pretty radical death to self from the very start. And this is why it tends to be naturally less attractive to a lot of young people, because the death to self is more obvious than it is in marriage. With the 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the religious adopts Jesus' own way of life, his way. And that's why it's sometimes known as the way of perfection. Edith Stein, one of my favourite writers, beautifully describes the 3 vows as being the 3 nails by which a religious is nailed onto her marital bed, the cross. Now, according to St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, because the religious isn't worried about a spouse or kids or the affairs of the world, he or she is unhindered in seeking union with God. And what this means is that, objectively speaking, religious life is the spiritually or the supernatural superior option. Subjectively, we should do what we're called to do. But objectively, if you have the choice, because you are called to religious life and you have the aptitude, you should choose religious life over marriage. Everyone, for the most part, can get married. You just got to find someone willing to marry you. Not everyone gets to marry God. Now, popularity-wise, I know that this is not the greatest claim to make. There's something about it that is really contrary to modern values. But it's a claim the church has always made, starting with Jesus himself in Matthew 19, then St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, then the Council of Trent, then all the way through Pope Pius XII, then the Second Vatican Council and St. Paul VI, and more recently, St. John Paul II in Vita Consecrata. So, spiritually speaking, vocations are hierarchical. And it makes sense that young people should approach their vocations in a similarly hierarchical way. And you can do this by asking yourself these questions in this order. So 1, do I want to be a saint? It's a great question, and it's the best to begin with. Unfortunately, not everyone actually asks themselves this question. But it's our first obligation, no matter what we end up doing. This is our first obligation, whether you're married or become a priest or become religious. 2, am I called to be religious, sister or nun? And young men can ask, am I called to be priest or religious? 3, if yes, does God want me in a contemplative order or a semi-active order? So does he want me in a cloistered convent, like Mother Dolores, or in an order that's a little bit out and about doing spiritual or corporal works of mercy? For example, the Sisters of Life. 4, if I'm not called to priesthood or religious life, should I enter the married state, and with whom? Now, obviously, that question doesn't get answered quickly. And 5, if I marry or remain celibate in the world, what job do I do? Now, notice that work is the last question in this list. Most people start planning their future by asking this question first. Now, it's not a bad question to ask. Work is important, and work can be a tool of sanctity. But in the grand scheme of what we're trying to do, which is become saints, it's not the most important. You see, although people often speak of their professions or paid work as a kind of calling, it isn't the same as the great vocations of marriage or the priesthood, religious life, or the consecrated celibacy. Work, in philosophical terms, is more a peripheral or tertiary instance of vocation. It's not the central case or focal meaning. And one of the main reasons for this is that the great vocations allow us to enter into the very inner life and work of God himself. In contrast to paid work, vocations are characterized by gift. Not just any gift, but the gift of a person. Vocations are, at their heart, relational. They're person to person, husband to wife, religious to divine spouse, immortal soul to immortal soul. Souls so beautiful, so worthwhile, that Christ himself, God himself, became incarnate and sacrificed himself on the cross out of love for those souls. And through our vocations, we are asked to love those souls in his name. It's so beautiful, I can't even talk about it without getting slightly choked up. And how are we meant to love these souls through our vocations? We're called to love with a Eucharistic love. And we're especially able to give this sort of love, whether we're married or religious, through our vocations. You see, when we enter into our vocations, we confine ourselves. We enter into a confinement. We confine ourselves to one person, or one order, or a cloister. And these confinements mimic the way that our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament confines himself in the tabernacle out of love for us. Our vocations are, in that sense, supernatural tabernacles, and they create a space within which our Lord can enter. And he enters into us, and he can purify our love and transform us. He's able to love through us and serve through us. And in return, we're given the greatest gift of freedom. I think a lot of people think that that it's a very deprived life, but if you've ever spent any time with Mother Dolores, you'll know that religious totally retain their personality. And if you've ever spent any time with the Sisters of Life, I have a couple of friends who are sisters, they're the most joyful people I know. And you can't fake that kind of joy. But going back to freedom, so paradoxically, we become free to truly love, free to choose the good, free to be our true selves, not in spite of these confinements, these tabernacle confinements, but because of them. And when we let him in, and we let God love through us and serve through us, our sacrifices, our vocations become like food that nourishes the souls entrusted to our care. They become a Eucharistic love, and this nourishment allows them to flourish. So our kiddos thrive when we give them healthy, loving marriages within which to grow. And likewise, a nun's marriage or a sister's marriage with Christ is food for his children. Her spiritual motherhood, so her love and her sacrifices, her prayer, helps us to flourish as a church. Healthy vocations should produce good fruit. It's a sign that something's very wrong when children and young adults don't flourish under our vocational care. It means they're not being nourished. It's even worse when they've been hurt or abused. Now, the reason I bring this up is that I suspect that what's been revealed of late and how it's been handled, even now, in addition to the doctrinal contradictions and upheaval, is going to hurt nascent vocations. I imagine it has to give pause to good men thinking about entering the seminary. And it has to give good pause to good women thinking about the convent. I know that as a parent, it gives me pause. Our church is in a dark period, possibly one of the worst she's faced, at least here in this country. But I hope that you can see our vocations and our lives as Catholic Christians, especially religious vocations, are really worthwhile and beautiful nonetheless, and very, very necessary. Now more than ever, we need joyful and loving religious sisters and nuns. We need their spiritual motherhood. Some of our church fathers have forgotten that they were given vocations to serve, not to be served, to love, not to be loved, to give, not to take, and to protect, not to corrupt. Thankfully, our religious sisters and nuns here in the US have not forgotten that. And I thank God for the faithful and joyful witness and example of women like Mother Dolores. It's always been in the darkest moments of the church that God has raised some of the greatest saints. And we, I mean me and I mean you, we are called to be those great saints. To quote St. Edith Stein, to be the spouse of Christ is to be given the most sublime vocation there is. And they are to be emissaries of his love, proclaimers of his will to kings and popes, and forerunners of his kingdom in the hearts of men. So young women, if God is knocking at your heart and he says, come follow me, then follow him. Go. Be his holy bride. The church needs you. Thank you.
Please join me in welcoming Mother Dolores Hart.
It is a marvelous experience to suddenly arrive to a moment, and many of you I know have come to that moment, when you suddenly realize that what is in front of you is far less than what you have lived. And do you really appreciate and understand what God has given you in your life? Because your life is suddenly the thing that becomes so immediate and important. I know as a youngster, I was always planning ahead, always deciding what was going to happen tomorrow. And of course, that's an illusion, because time only exists right now. It does not exist in what happened and in what's going to happen, except in the values of memory and in the values of experience. The things that are deep in you, they really do begin to tell you something, not of your profession, but of your heart's call. What is it that you love? And that, for me, was the secret of finding my vocation. Because the one thing that I liked to do when I was little more than anything was to be thought of as an actress. I wanted to do what my daddy did, but I wanted to do it my way. And I would go to the theater, and I would go in the back, and I would talk to the theater. And I would say, "You open your doors for me, because I'm coming in." And I'm going to do it too. And I had such a grand and free sense of joy that that's what I wanted to do. But I was too little to understand how many actors and actresses there are in New York, in Pasadena, in Los Angeles, in Chicago. Every city has a pile of persons who want to be known in that career. But I didn't even think of it then. It was just, I was going to do it. And I tried in every possible way in school to set myself up for it. In high school, I did everything to be part of the acting class. And I did win a scholarship to college, which totally thrilled me to the fact that, yeah, maybe I'm right. Because by then I was beginning to understand there was a contemplative competition in this that was pretty stiff. And I also prayed very deeply to the Lord, "You've got to help me, because I've got a big and a long road to go if this works." Well, the Lord certainly did help me, because the very first thing that happened, I got a role in a play in Loyola University of St. Joan. And there were people from the Paramount acting school, but also Mr. Hal Wallace's field. He came to see the show. And they sent me a message. And I went home to Marymount, that they wanted me to come in and do a screen test. Well, I thought it was one of my boyfriends, giving me a... And he said, "Look, I just talked to your mom, because you're underage, And she thought we were also phonies. We're not." And so I said, "Okay, believe me, we're with you." And I went to Paramount. My boyfriend, incidentally, had an old hearse, one of those. He had gotten it at very low price because it was no use anymore. But I tell you, it was classy when you drove around in it. And of course, driving up to Paramount in that hearse, it reminded you of Gloria Swanson. I was aware of that too, So Anyway, we did get the screen test, and I did get a chance then to actually meet Mr. Wallace. He was at that time, I think, one of the most effective and fine producers in the industry. And I was very grateful just to have the meeting. But he said, no, I really want you to be in this. I want you to act opposite Mr. Elvis. And then he didn't say his name. He just said, and I also want you to be there with Wendell Corey and the woman, I always forget her name. Anyway, the point being, I went to meet all of these folks, and when we got to the gentleman singer, he said, this is Mr. Elvis, and he stood up, and I said, Elvis Presley. I said, well, what do you do? I'm not joking. I'm not making it up. I swear you. I was in school, and I had no ear for understanding the music of the time. And he was really kind enough to stand up and say to me, I'm a singer. And so I said, well, I sing Gregorian chant. And they said, well, someday we can work it out. We can work it out. So we did the first film, which was Loving You. And it was a very, very amazing gift because Elvis in those years was young and very, very much his mother's boy. He had not yet been drowned by all of the wants and the do's that Hollywood can pour on a poor actor. I did want a career where I could win an Oscar. I really wanted to go for the best. And I was not, I was, let me say, I was blinded by the excellence of money and all it could buy to want that for myself and for my family. And so the words that the Lord were telling me took a long time to penetrate this thick head. But little by little, as I moved into my career, and especially when I did a film that was quite other than anything I thought I would ever be used in. It was a film about a young woman who had been in Auschwitz, a young Jewish woman who had been used as medical experiments. And when I was cast for this, I really was floored because I did not see, first of all, how I could play, honestly, a Jewish woman. But the woman that they had in mind had been Jewish from Holland. And there were many blue-eyed Holland women there who did profess the Jewish faith and who did get in serious trouble during the war. Because if anything the 20th century did, the evil spirit showed us how to fight. I think every century has a different message from that spirit that we've got to find out as fast as we can. Because how many people died in the course of all of those battles that went on? And as I got taken to play the part of Lisa, who was the name of the film, and Stephen Boyd was named to be my partner in the film, I learned in that context very rapidly what can happen to a soul, the soul that is in us, that lives for a husband, that lives for children, that lives for love, and can do that in many different contexts. But I was very shocked by what happens to people without a spirit of love, and when that spirit of love gets sold out for something as cheaply as a swastika on your coat. I was very, very open at that time to an offering from a young man who had said to me on our first date, Don Robinson, the first date we went to, he said, "Can we marry?" And I said, "Don, can we talk about it after dessert?" But he was as naive and simple and beautiful as those words. Because Don, as you know, we did not get married, but Don stayed my friend every year. He came to see me twice a year. He never married. And he began his own personal way to God in accepting my vocation. Let me say, when the time came, and I was actually, Don and his sister and friends had given a big party because everybody by this time knew that we loved each other and that we were engaged, and it should be, and everybody else was planning it for me. And that was God's way of letting it work itself through. Because by this time, after we got out of this party and we were driving on the way home, finally Don stopped the car and he said, "Dolores, where were you tonight? You weren't present. You weren't even there. All of those people coming to love you, and where were you?" And I said, "Don, I've got to tell you, but first I need a few days, and I will tell you." And I went home and I called to get airplane tickets to get me to New York, and then from New York up to Bethlehem. And when I got to Bethlehem, Mother Placid was a very dear old friend of mine there. And I said, "Mother, I've got to talk to the abbess." And so she set me up, and I went in again to see Mother Benedict. And I said, "Mother, what is going on in me? Please help me. I don't know what to do." And she said, "Well, what do you want, Dolores?" I said, "Well, I want an Oscar." And yes, I understand that, but why are you here? I don't have one to give you here. What are you doing here at the Abbey? Why have you suddenly turned up? I said, "Mother, something inside of me is absolutely on fire. I don't understand that. I just want to know, can you help me?" And she said, "Yes, if you'll tell me what it is you're going on in you. You've got it." Well, anyway, we went around and around and around and around for at least another hour, that poor woman. And finally I left the parlor and I went down, and Mother Placid was waiting for me. And I said, "Mother, do you have my things? I've got to get ready to go." And she said, "Yes, I know. When's it going to happen?" I said, "What?" And she said, "Well, you're entering here, aren't you?" I said, "Where did you hear that?" And she said, "Well, the abbess just told me that you were nuts about it, that you just couldn't get it to it, but that's what you wanted." And I said, "Mother," and she said, "Well, do you want me to tell her that she's wrong?" And I said, "No, Mother, I knew." And it took that good friend looking me in the eye and talking me down. It always takes somebody else who pins you down to the truth. I don't believe in hermits. At least not for me. But anyway, she said, all right. Mother Abbess said, if this is what you want to do, you go home and get rid of all of my possessions. I said, that's right. And I said, my fur coat, that's right. I said, my dog, yes, that's right. You have to find a home for everything and be back here in 6 months. And please do not talk to anybody about it. I don't want it in the paper that you're entering the monastery. Because June Haver just went in and out on that very topic. So I promised. And I got back into the car, the plane, and Don was waiting for me, and we stopped at a restaurant. And we were in the center of the restaurant, in this little table. And he said, well, now, Dolores, tell me, what is happening? So I told him. And he sat there in a minute. And then he stood up to his feet, and he yelled out, no! All the people in the restaurant turned around. They didn't know what I'd done to him. And then he said, I'm sorry. He said, you're right. I'm sure that's what it is, because it's been torturing me that's what you wanted. And I know it's what you want, and I am with you, and I will stay with you in this. I promise you. I said, Don, you can't do that. You've got to find your own future now. You are your own man. You can't be trapped by this. I refuse to. And he said, it's none of your business. So anyway, that was how it began. Well, it wasn't more than a month, or let's say, not a month. Yes, because it would have been February, March. It was in all the papers. I don't know where in the world it happened, but it was good in one sense. I did have ways to get rid of a lot of stuff. And I did not tell my mom exactly what was happening. I just asked her if she would come back with me to the Abbey. And so when the time came, and we came back, and I gave her the coat, and she looked at me and she said, when are you entering this place? I said, Mom, I'm going in probably within a couple of days, because I've made all the arrangements. Well, she just hated the idea. Mom was only, if you remember, 16 when I was created, 17 when I was born. So we were like sisters. So there was a very good and open relationship. But she just said, look, I'm with you whatever you do. I love you, and I'll be with you. And she was, until the day she died. And again, that relational base. And I suppose, my friends, I don't want to keep you all night on this, because I want you to know basically what I'm here to tell you. Whether or not one is married, and this lady is beautifully married, and a wonderful, wonderful person to look up to and to listen to. And I absolutely know that I needed my spousal compliments also. When I use that word, spousal compliments, it sounds like a big fancy word. What it means is people who go deep enough and love you from the heart, and love you with an intention that is absolutely their life too. And there were those persons that stood by me and helped me and gave me the strength to listen to what was in my heart. Because the moment I stepped on the ground of Regina Laudis, 6 years before I finally made the entrance, the moment I stepped on that ground, something in me knew this was where I loved and what I loved, and this was my life. It's got to be that voice in you. It's like when you look in the face of a beloved person and you know it's real. And you know that's where you belong, is within that face, within that body, within that person. And when that person becomes Jesus Christ, that person exists in the most amazing ways of communication, in the most amazing people. And something allows you to go to a deeper communion than sexual communion. And that deeper communion is a sexuality of eternity. Because that reality, that real and protective, beautiful sense of truth in sexuality is your experience of eternity. And the way I looked that up and tried to pursue it was the fact that God is love. We know that God is love. And there are 3 persons in God. And so in God, love is experienced in the giving of love, the receiving of love, and the creation of being. That's how the baby Jesus was born, because those 3 elements of God were at work in the Blessed Mother's body. And whenever there is a giving, a receiving, and a birth, in any way that you know, because that can happen when you paint the most glorious painting, and you're now, what's his name? The great painter of this. Pardon? Michelangelo, that's right. I mean, anyone that has that greatness is going to be born out of the reality that God is love and has promised him to create that in some way. And whether it's Michelangelo's paintings who are born, or the most magnificent expression, the baby Jesus Christ is born, God is there in constant movement and givenness to creation, to make creation the most perfect expression of himself in complement in another. And it's a very hard thing to understand until you stop trying to understand it and pray with it and let it be born in you. And when it's born in you, you will understand that newness. That newness will just send you right to the clouds, because you will know for yourself why you are created, why you are the most individual person with that name and with that future. And you'll know why you have to do this much to keep that body and that mind and that heart going, and whether it's marrying that man, that John or that Don, or whoever his name will be when you marry him, or if it is marrying into the community or into whatever form of love that God has in mind for you. It's real. I'm here to promise you it's absolutely real. So I beg of you tonight, please read this book. Begin to ask, where are you called? Allow someone whose mind, whose heart, whose voice can touch you as Rachael does, because it's absolutely beautiful, and it will take you into a center of your own communing. And when you get through with that, just remember that crazy lady up there who said it was real. All right? Is that a deal? Okay. God bless you all. Thank you.
How are you guys doing? Good. We're going to have a little bit of banter, a little bit of chit-chat here with Rachael and Mother Dolores. I want to say I've read almost all of this entire book, and I'm going to echo what Cole said earlier in his opening comments, and he had mentioned how he's actually gotten a lot out of the book. And I'm 30 years old. I'm a male. I'm not looking to discern or enter religious life, but when I read the book, I found it so filled with practical tips, practical spiritual tips. What I've just heard yourself, Rachael, and you, Mother, kind of talk about, generally speaking, seems to be the drama in the soul of the individual who is making this step for discernment. And I want to ask you first, Rachael, speaking of that drama of the soul and speaking specifically about a part of the book here where you talked about the importance of silence. That struck me so much, and it strikes me now as we're sitting in New York, one of the busiest, loudest cities in the world. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of silence for discernment?
Well, I actually think silence is important for everyone, not just in discernment, because if you think about God, God speaks with a soft, still voice. If you think about in the Old Testament when he called Samuel, it was in the middle of the night. Samuel was quiet, he was asleep. Samuel, Samuel. So we need to build in silence into our lives, especially if you're discerning, because that's a big key part of it is trying to hear God's call, hear how God speaks to your soul, go out, meet some sisters, try a convent, then sit back. What do I feel? What's God talking to me? What was the fruit of that? And so you need silence to be able to really develop and go into that relationship with God.
And Mother Dolores, in your own vocation story and being in Hollywood, what were the times where you were able to find silence? How did silence help you in your vocation? I can imagine being in Hollywood, and you shared with us today how at times it was very difficult. At times you had that struggle. And if you could share with us a little bit about the importance of silence in your discernment, and then, of course, now being contemplative, it's very much a part of your life.
Well, I think it would probably be best to start later because, as you know, in our community, or maybe you don't know, we sing Gregorian chant, and we sing the office 7 times. In the morning at 6, again at 8, in 12 o'clock noon, at 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night, and 2 o'clock in the morning. Each one of those times is some time of prayer with Gregorian chant. And one of the ironic things that I was absolutely drilled to the wall to accept and understand was that chant, you have to understand the modes and all the points of silence. Because if you sing without understanding the silence, Kyrie eleison, if you don't know how to hold the moment of silence in those songs, you don't understand that chant is built on the stopping points where the mind can receive the Spirit. And there's a great excellence that is demanded of any young person to learn all the modes, 7 modes and 8, that each one of those has definite rules, and the rules demand of you how to keep the proper silence so that when you sing, it has a possibility of communion. And I think going back in the earlier parts of my life, that was what was necessary for me, was to learn to be still amidst all the stuff that can come to you as being excellent, as being wonderful, as being worth it, and really say, is it? Does it really mean that much?
Beautiful. I just want to read kind of Called by God, Discernment and Preparation for Religious Life. And that title couldn't be more fitting, and I think as well the importance of it in the time that we're living in and the time that the church is engaged with, which has definitely seen its fair share of scandals within the church. And I think to myself, so many of those religious, those involved with the scandals probably didn't have good discernment. They probably didn't have good preparation for religious life. And I think that's just, again, when I read this book, it just felt so timely to me. Like it was something that was so important. I'm so glad it's out. Again, as someone who is both married and as a male, I read the book and I was able to get so many beautiful spiritual tips, I'll call them, but I think they're much deeper than that. And so I would encourage anybody here, whether you know someone, you know, a young girl who's interested in religious life or young men who are maybe thinking of the priesthood, this book I think has a lot to offer the church in general. Rachael, if there's one thing you wanted to share with the audience here today that you would really want them to take away from this book, please share it with us. Could be more than one. There's a lot of good stuff.
Marriage and religious life interfeed and depend on one another in the economy of grace. And that it's that we're all called to be saints, and that religious life is a very beautiful way of pursuing that, but that we're all in it together, trying to be saints and work towards heaven.
I like to read the point and that says here, consider what most often leads you to sin. What is generally the cause or source of my sadness and joy? What is the general motive of my actions, the ordinary origin of my sins, especially when it is not a question of an accidental sin, but rather a succession of sin or state of resistance to grace? Notably, when this resistance persists for several days and leads me to omit my exercises of piety. I thought that was so simple and true, that it's not this one thing or that one thing. But if we have the courage to watch ourselves and see what takes us up and what takes us down.